Welcome to the Electricity of Life, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. The connection of the mind to the body is an arena of constantly growing scientific investigation. To an unprecedented degree, mainstream medicine today acknowledges that the mind has a profound effect on one's physical well-being. The mind affects matter, whether it's the so-called placebo effect, where the mere belief that a person has taken a particular drug causes a physical benefit, to the increasingly evident impact of emotional stress on physical organisms and individual cells. However, as mainstream science acknowledges, the very nature and source of the mind itself remains a mystery. A remarkable scientist who has explored the mind-body connection is Dawson Church, the author of dozens of scientific papers, as well as the recent book, Mind to Matter, which suggests vast untapped abilities of the mind to effect healing. In part one of this two-part interview, we asked Dawson to begin with an introduction to his earlier book, entitled The Genie in Your Genes, which presents voluminous scientific evidence that thoughts and intentions can trigger one's genes with potentially great consequence to one's health.
Well, I became interested in energy healing at an early age, and when I was 15, I joined a spiritual community and began to learn tools like meditation, like energy medicine, and in that community, I saw some really remarkable, rapid healings occur. But I always thought about energy medicine, energy healing as being a very fringe endeavor. And so in the 1990s, 1980s, it was regarded as being part of complementary and alternative medicine, or CAM, C-A-M. And there was no real thought that CAM could ever become part of the medical mainstream. We knew the medical mainstream involved things like drugs and surgery, interventions by skilled medical professionals, and there was no real place for CAM in conventional medicine. But what began to happen in the late 1990s is scientists turned their attention to using some of the tools developed for diagnosis to looking at altered states of consciousness. And so we, for example, for the first time found people meditating, getting put inside MRIs or having EEGs attached to their heads, and actually reading things like brain states and brain waves that were the result of shifts in awareness, shifts in consciousness, shifts in energy. And what we found as we used these modern methods was that a lot was happening in the heads and the bodies of those kinds of people. So at a certain point, I moved from psychological research, looking at anxiety, depression, PTSD, to biological research. And around 2008, 2009, I began to look deep into what was happening inside the body when people shift their state. And so I wrote this book, The Genie in Your Genes, about the epigenetics of personal change, how when you change your consciousness, you're literally shifting gene expression inside your cells. And this is easy to prove. When I wrote the book, there was no direct proof of this, but there was lots of indirect proof of this. Because, for example, when you get scared or startled or frightened, your adrenaline level rises, and there's a gene that codes for adrenaline, a gene that codes for cortisol. But when you then go and tell your best friend or your wife or your husband about being scared or startled or frightened, say you had a bad experience at work and you had a high level of cortisol, a high level of adrenaline in response to a threat at work, now you're telling your spouse about this after you get back from work, and your adrenaline is now rising again. So there's no direct threat to you at this point, only a shift in awareness, only emotion, only a sense of changing your consciousness, changing your energy to relive that threat. But your body is now taking that imaginary situation as though it was a real threat and producing those same stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. So I did the first large-scale randomized controlled trial. It was actually a triple-blind randomized controlled trial published in the oldest medical journal in the US. And it showed that when you use an acupressure-based technique, EFT, that in 1 hour, you're literally bringing the levels of those stress hormones down far more than talk therapy or simply resting. And so that was really a landmark study showing that indirectly, I was showing that we're changing gene expression because we're changing the byproducts of gene expression like cortisol and adrenaline. I then went to study a step deeper than that and actually looked at gene expression. And with the conclusion of the Human Genome Project, we now have tools that allow us to much less expensively sequence genetic sequences and actually see what's happening, which genes are being turned on, which genes are being turned off. So I worked with a group of veterans, people, mostly Vietnam veterans, some Iraq veterans, Afghanistan veterans, and we looked at their levels of gene expression before and after 10 sessions of this acupressure-based technique, EFT. And we found that their levels of anxiety dropped, depression dropped hugely, their levels of PTSD, their levels of symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and so on. All of these things dropped dramatically, over 50% over those 10 sessions. We hit pay dirt. We found that their genes actually were shifting dramatically. Several of their genes to do with stress, to do with inflammation, to do with the byproducts of the metabolic signatures of stress were being shifted by this psychological intervention. So now as you change your mind, as you change your awareness, as you change your emotional response, as you use an effective therapy like EFT to get rid of those emotions. So you're telling the story of the terrible experiences in Afghanistan or Iraq, or civilian ones like a car crash or a divorce. So now you're telling all those same stories to people, but they're no longer laden with emotion. And so now your body's no longer getting that epigenetic signal to make those stress hormones. So those veterans then, after those 10 sessions, were telling those stories, remembering those events, and they were no longer triggering those stress genes. And so that's led to several other studies like that. The big take-home message for this was that as you shift your awareness, as you lower your stress level, you're literally turning genes on and off in your body. And in the Genie in Your Genes, I map that whole process from start to finish, how both actual threats cause changes in gene expression and imaginary experiences like meditation. Meditate for a while and you shift your gene expression. Do EFT, you shift gene expression. Do yoga, do Qigong, take a walk in nature. Any of these things are literally turning genes on and off. And as we've used these elaborate tools like MRIs and EEGs to look at how much, we're finding that the answer is a huge amount. That we're not seeing trivial or minor shifts in gene expression. We're not seeing trivial or minor shifts in brainwave activity. We're seeing major shifts, radical shifts in the way the brain processes information based purely on these energy and consciousness techniques. So that work in the Genie in Your Genes made that argument really early in 2004, but the newer editions now have many studies showing directly that our awareness, our consciousness, our energy level, our way of seeing the world, our worldview, our mental picture of reality, all of these things are turning genes on and off. And I'll just leave you with one final study, an amazing study, and it shows the cumulative effect of this, which you see in longevity. So people make a lot of little choices in their lives. Should I drink tea or coffee this morning? Should I get up on the left or the right side of the bed? And, those choices are minor, but when those choices are about emotion, when those choices are about spirituality, when those choices are about stress, they may seem minor. Just that 5 minutes you spent obsessing about the bad thing someone did to you last week might seem like a trivial thing. But cumulatively, over a year, and then 5 and 10 and 20 years, they make an enormous difference to your gene expression, which shows up in the form of longevity. And so this one really stunning study I talk about shows that optimists, people who think positively, people who have a positive worldview, people who see others in a positive light, optimists live on average 8 years longer than pessimists. That's the cumulative effect of all that negative thinking. Think negatively for a moment, you don't see any big change. Think negatively for a lifetime, and you get 8 years less of it. And so these are the profound shifts that these kinds of emotional states are producing epigenetically in our cells.
The scientific evidence that thoughts and emotions affect one's genes carries another extraordinary ramification. That genetic changes caused by emotional trauma might be passed on to future generations.
That study showing that emotional trauma is intergenerational was stunning, because we always thought that if a bad thing happened to me, well, it was going to affect me. It might produce PTSD, it might produce trauma in me, but how could that really be passed along to my kids or my grandkids? Because they're going to have a fresh set of genes. They're going to be born with these genes that are unaffected by that. But in the study of Holocaust survivors, this is the first big study done in the late 1990s, they found that the gene expression patterns of the children of Holocaust survivors looked similar to those, mirrored those of actual Holocaust survivors. We've now shown in animal studies with rats and mice that those kinds of epigenetic tags can be passed along for 7 generations. So we're now realizing that stress and trauma is not something that affects just one generation of people, that affects people in a limited way locally. We're realizing that it affects them over time, and they then literally pass these epigenetic molecular markers onto their children and their grandchildren.
A parallel field of investigation to the mind-body connection is the study of consciousness itself. We asked Dawson for his thoughts on the perspective that consciousness is not generated by, nor confined to the brain.
The old view, the materialist worldview, was that mind is what's called an epiphenomenon of complex brains. And the idea is that originally there were single-celled organisms, then multi-celled organisms, then complex organisms. As organisms became more and more complicated, they got bigger and bigger brains, more complex brains, and eventually this threw up this phenomenon called mind. That's a result of brain activity. But there's no actual proof for that point of view. And in my book, Mind to Matter, I quote many neuroscientists, many authorities who point this out, who say that there's really no proof, no empirical proof that mind is the epiphenomenon of a complex brain. And what the brain seems to do more accurately is it seems to be receiving and transducing information and then manifesting it on a physical level. So the brain is much more like a receiver of information than it is like a producer of information. Just the way someone's listening to this podcast right now and they're listening to it on a device. So the words I'm speaking and the words you're speaking and this interaction isn't happening inside of their smartphone. And that's the conceit of the materialist worldview. We think that because there's this broadcast coming out of the smartphone, well, then the smartphone has to be the source of the broadcast. We don't realize that the broadcast is coming from a distant location. And so there are lots of examples. There's lots of science now behind distant mental effects and the distant phenomenon of consciousness. And so what the research does show is that there's far more evidence for the idea of consciousness being something that permeates the universe. There's something which I talk about in the very beginning of Mind to Matter. I talk about non-local mind, and our local minds are anchored in our local brains. So if, for example, I talk about me, Dawson, I'm talking about an individual and an identity that's anchored in a local sense of self, which I associate with my body and my circumstances. So that's the local me. But there's far more to me than the local me. There's far more to me than the local sense of self. And so when meditators, for example, enter a deep meditation, a part of the brain called the parietal lobe, which locates your body in space, that part of the brain shuts down. The prefrontal cortex that constructs the self shuts down. There's a massive drop in the amount in the consumption of oxygen and of nutrients by those two parts of the brain. And so people literally begin to have a non-local sense of self. They describe a feeling of oneness. They feel a sense of peace. They feel a sense of connection with the rest of the universe. In these states of consciousness, all kinds of non-local phenomena occur. So people who are in this non-local space report experiences of precognition, knowing the future, what's happening in the future before it happens. And there's really good evidence for precognition. Telepathy, the EEG is one of the most pervasive instruments used by modern science, the electroencephalograph, and there are thousands of studies now that plot our brain waves using the EEG. But when I was writing Mind to Matter, I became interested in the guy who invented the EEG, whose name is Hans Berger, and he was a German doctor in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And he got his big insight about inventing a device to measure brain waves when he had an experience of non-local reality. He was actually a German military officer, and one day he was on his horse and he was part of a horse team towing a huge big field gun in the late 1800s, and his horse reared up and threw him right in the path of this rolling gun. And just as the gun was about to crush him, his friends managed to stop the gun, and he wasn't crushed. That night, he got a telegram from his father saying, "I've been concerned about you. How are you?" And he never got a telegram from his father before. But it turned out his sister that day, at the very moment he was about to be crushed by the gun, had this premonition of a terrible thing about to happen to him, told the father who sent the telegram. So there are all these examples of people, even in science. Einstein said that all great scientific discoveries come from these states in which you're letting go of the local self and connecting with a non-local self. That's where inspiration comes from. That's where creativity comes from. And so the brain is the anchor of that non-local mind in local experience. And that's really where the evidence is pointing. When I began to write my book, Mind to Matter, I thought I would find a chain of evidence linking our thoughts to manifestation in things. But I didn't think I'd find a complete chain. I thought I would find that science would reveal a number of links in that chain, and there'd be some big gaps in the chain as well. And I was amazed when I got to the end of the book that there are no missing links in the chain. They're all there. They're all there scientifically. And so that was one big surprise to me in writing Mind to Matter. The other was the scale and the size of some of these phenomena. And in the first chapter, I tell the story of this astrophysicist turned TV reporter called Graham Phillips. And he has a show in Australia called Catalyst. And he'd heard about meditation and that meditation had health benefits. And so he thought, well, I should give it a try. He wasn't a believer. He was a bit of a skeptic, but he went into Monash University, a very distinguished university in Australia, and he had a complete workup of his physical function and his brain. So they measured the volume of every single part of his brain and also tested his neurological function. He then began to practice mindfulness, and after just 2 weeks, he found that his whole way of reacting to stress had changed. He could feel and see the difference in his behavior. When he went back to the university after 8 weeks, now again, this is only 2 months of practicing meditation and mindfulness, they did this complete battery of tests on him again. And they found that things like his reaction speed, his memory and learning capacity had increased exponentially. And a part of the brain that regulates emotions, and its job is to regulate emotion across different brain regions, is called the dentate gyrus. It's right in the very center of the brain, the center of the hippocampus, the memory and learning center of the brain. The dentate gyrus spreads out, though, and it actually helps different parts of the brain region coordinate their regulation of emotion. So in 8 weeks, the volume of neural tissue in Graham Phillips's brain, in the dentate gyrus, had increased by 22.8%. Now that's an enormous difference. That's more than a fifth growth in that one brain region in less than 2 months. So just a remarkable shift just in brain software activity, but in brain hardware as well. And so what I'm arguing is in Mind to Matter, what I'm showing is in these studies, they reveal that our brains are changing substantially, remarkably, and quickly in response to consciousness. When our awareness changes, when we de-stress ourselves, when we tap, when we meditate, when we do all these things that help us feel better, those subjective feelings of well-being translate into objective changes in measures like the volume of neural tissue in different parts of the brain. So if you, for example, have been a person who's been angry and stressed and upset and resentful for a long time, you've been growing those neural circuits for a long time, and they get worse and worse and worse. PTSD, people with PTSD, they get worse over time, generally speaking. But if you fill your mind and heart with love, with compassion, with kindness, if you make that choice over and over and over again, as Graham Phillips did, you are then building up those circuits that have to do with all of those phenomena, and you're then a resilient human being. You have this core of resilience that can really help you when times are tough or when you have life setbacks. So I was intrigued by his case history of how we're literally turning the software of consciousness, of mind, into the hardware of brain.